Hi, my name is Alex Perry, and today I'm going to show you how to adjust the settings on your camera to achieve those awesome cinematic looking videos. Alright, so let's get to it. Now, I will be doing a deep dive into all the different settings there are to achieve this cinematic looking footage. There is a lot to know and learn. Now, I feel like I could have done a very quick video, and there's lots out there on just like dial in these settings on your camera and you'll get cinematic footage. But I really feel like that won't be helping you out too much, because not every scenario requires the exact same settings. So if you have an understanding of what the settings are and what they do, this will actually help you even more when you're in certain scenarios and settings where it might not just be as quick and easy as just dialing in numbers that some guy off the internet told you to use on your camera. So let's jump right into it. Now, the things that we'll be talking about are setting your resolution, your frame rate, setting your shutter speed, your aperture, and your white balance. Properly dialing in these 5 settings is what will really help you achieve that cinematic look that everybody's always talking about. So before we do anything, we're gonna grab our camera. Now, it doesn't really matter what camera you have. They all should have similar settings and similar dials and, the buttons on your actual camera. So the first thing we're gonna do is at the top, normally it's with a wheel. I've got the Sony a6300. So I've got this little dial on the top here to choose the shooting mode. So I'm gonna just dial it into the movie icon. So typically this is represented by a little film strip. So by putting it into this mode, this will allow us to most likely choose all these different settings and really customize it for how we wanna actually film using that setting. Okay, so the first 2 things that we'll be talking about are setting your resolution and choosing your frame rate. Now, these 2 things are very tied to each other, which is why I'm kind of grouping them together. Resolution isn't anywhere near as important as the frame rate is, but it's still important to choose what kind of resolution you want to shoot at right from the get-go. So if your camera supports it, either set it to 1080p at 24p or 4K at 24p. So on my camera, I go to menu, then I go to the file format area, and I have the option of choosing either XAVCS 4K or XAVCS HD. So the HD option is what would be 1080p, and the 4K option is for 4K resolution. So if we choose one of those, then the next thing you would see is record settings. So when you click on there, you've got the options of 30p or 24p. So these might be different depending on the camera you have, whether you're shooting on Sony, Nikon, Canon, whatever else is out there. And most cameras are limited when you choose 4K resolution, what you can choose for these settings here for the frame rate. So for example, if I go back to file format and choose the HD option, now I've got settings for things like 60p, 30p, 24p, or 120p. So those are all the different frame rates that my camera can shoot at. Now, if your camera can support shooting in 4K, even if you don't intend on outputting your final video in 4K, I still recommend shooting it that way for a number of reasons. Now, because you have that extra resolution and that many more pixels that you're filming it at and that you're recording, you have a lot more to play around with. So if your output file is going to be in 1080p and you set up your sequence like that in your editing software, you'll be able to do some pretty cool things. So let's say you wanted to crop your shot differently, you want to zoom it in a little bit, you'll be able to do that very easily without seeing any, pixelation or blurriness to your footage. If you shoot at 1080p and you put it as a 1080p video in your timeline, you'll still be able to do things like zoom in, but you can only go so far without really noticing that it does get pixelated or blurry. You could also do things like mimic camera movements when you have that extra resolution to play with. So once again, by shooting in 4K, you've got that extra resolution, your image is that much bigger, you can zoom it in quite a bit, and then you can mimic, camera pans like from left to right, up and down, go diagonally, or you can do an actual zoom animation where it starts off zoomed out and it's zooming further in or going the opposite way. So this is a lot easier to play around with when you've got that extra 4K resolution that you're squeezing down to a 1080p video. So now, like I mentioned earlier, The 24p here that we did choose represents the frame rate. Now, these next two parts are probably going to be the most technical of this whole video, so bear with me, but trust me, you don't have to remember absolutely every little technical aspect of what I'm saying here. It's more important to just remember the settings that we are going to be choosing, but it's very easy to create a little cheat sheet if you want. So you can make some notes in your notebook, you can even type up a little card and print it out and keep it with you, just for future reference while you're on set or on location filming a video. Okay, so first things first, you might be wondering, what is a frame rate? So the frame rate is how many individual frames of footage you're recording or seeing per second. So when you're filming, you're actually capturing a series of still images at a fast rate that are then sequentially played back quick enough for it to appear like it's actually in motion. So the frame rate that movies are typically displayed in is 24 frames per second, and they're also commonly filmed in this frame rate as well. Now this can vary from scene to scene in any production or video, but usually if footage is shot at a different frame rate, it is conformed to a 24p timeline and output video. So for general rule of thumb, if you just want normal looking footage that's not sped up or slowed down, it will be shot and displayed in 24 frames per second. Now, although frame rate is one of the most important things to get right when you want to achieve that cinematic look, this alone will not get you that look you're going for. So the next thing we're going to discuss is the shutter speed. The shutter speed is the amount of time the shutter remains open to expose an image. Now, I know this might seem a bit odd, since when you're filming video, you'd think the shutter remains open the whole time to capture everything. Well, actually, with digital cameras, the shutter is digitally opening and closing at the rate that you set it to for the duration of your recording. So essentially, the shutter is opening and closing a certain number of times per second to expose the individual frames it's capturing. And when taken in combination with the frame rate, is capturing a certain number of frames per second to ultimately leave you with a video clip. So the longer the shutter remains open, the more light is being let in to the sensor, which would ultimately leave you with a brighter looking image. And on the flip side, the shorter amount of time the shutter remains open, the less light that comes in, making your overall image darker. Now, there is a general rule of thumb for deciding on what shutter speeds to use when you're filming. This is typically known as the 180-degree rule. The 180-degree rule is a standard that is used in the film industry. To mimic the same way the human eye experiences motion in real life, the 180-degree rule states that shutter speeds should be set to double that of your frame rate. Now, it won't always be possible to get exactly double the frame rate, so it's okay to go as close as possible to double. So for example, if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you want your shutter speed to be at 1/48th of a second. So the 48th is what is double that of 24. So this means that the shutter is open for 1/48th of a second, recording the image for every frame it captures at a rate of 24 individual frames per second of footage. Now, most DSLRs and mirrorless cameras like this one actually don't have the option to shoot at 1/48th of a second, but a lot of them do have the option of shooting at 1/50th of a second. So that is what is typically used in these types of cameras. This is perfectly fine because it is so close to 1/48th that you wouldn't even notice a difference. Now, once again, the reason we are following this rule is so that we can mimic what the human eye sees in terms of motion, right? So using these types of settings, we typically do get the same type of effect that we naturally see with our eyes when things are moving. So to test this out, you can actually stick your hand directly in front of your face and look straight ahead. Now, without following your hand as it moves, move your hand back and forth, right? So keep looking straight ahead and move your hand back and forth. Notice how you see a little bit of that like blur trail that's kind of following your hand in whichever direction it's going, right? So that amount of motion blur is what following the 180-degree rule is actually trying to achieve. So now, following what we've learned so far, let's say we wanted to shoot in slow motion. That means we have to capture more frames per second and then play them back at a different, slower rate to play more of those frames. So essentially, we're capturing a lot more frames and playing them back at 24 frames per second. Now, I know this might sound complicated, so stay with me. So normally when we shoot at 24 frames per second, we will be seeing 24 frames played in the duration of 1 second of time. If we then decide to shoot at 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second, which are two very common frame rates for shooting slow motion, we are now capturing either 60 frames for every second we are recording or 120 frames for every second we are recording. If we want to see this footage in slow motion, we have to play it back at a rate of 24 frames per second. So by conforming a 60 or 120 frames per second clip to a 24p timeline, we'll need more time to view all the frames we have captured in every second of footage we have recorded. So it will take significantly longer to view this video clip because we have more frames to view and it's being played back at a much slower rate to that which we recorded it. And for this footage to look cinematic or to have the same level of motion blur our eyes are used to seeing, we need to follow the 180-degree rule and shoot with a shutter speed of 1/120th of a second for 60 FPS footage, or 1/240th or 1/250th if your camera doesn't have 1/240th for 120 FPS footage. Whew! You got through the most complicated and technical parts of this video. So congratulations, we're almost there. But there's still a few more things you need to know to really complete the overall cinematic look. So the next thing that will impact how your image or video looks is the aperture. The aperture is a hole or opening through which light travels. So basically, changing the aperture will change the size of the opening in your lens to make it bigger or smaller, which would either allow more or less light in. This also affects the depth of field of your footage. Depth of field is the distance between the nearest and farthest objects that are in acceptably sharp focus in an image. So if you have a shallow depth of field, you will have a very small field in your plane of vision that will be sharp or in focus. This is what you typically see in close-ups in movies, where an actor will be framed with just their head in the frame and anything behind them is very soft, blurry, or out of focus. Typically, this is achieved by changing the aperture to open up the opening in the lens more, which lets more light in. Aperture is measured in f-stops, and the lower the number, the more open the lens is, which once again lets in more light and softens or blurs the background more. An aperture of f1.4 would give you an extremely narrow or shallow depth of field, making only a small section sharp and in focus and having a very soft and blurred out background. Shooting in an aperture of f11 would give you a larger area of sharpness, meaning more things in your frame will be in focus and sharp. This is achieved by having a much smaller opening in the lens for light to pass through. Now, this isn't only important to know for the visual aesthetic of how your videos look, but also for exposure. So if you're following the 180-degree rule and shooting at 24 frames per second at 1/50th of a second, and you use an aperture of f1.4, you will be letting a lot of light in. So unless you're shooting a darker scene, your image might be too bright or overexposed. So for example, if we were shooting outside on a bright and sunny day in the middle of the day using these settings, your image would be way overexposed. You probably wouldn't even be able to see anything properly on your camera. It would be like so white and blown out, wouldn't be able to use it. Alternatively, if you shoot at 24 frames per second, at 1/50th of a second, at f11, and you shoot it indoors at nighttime with only a couple small dimmed lights on, your image will be way too dark. So there are a few things you can do to make sure you don't have to change your settings if you still want to achieve that same visual look. Let's address the overexposed scenario first. If you want to have a nice close-up with that beautiful shallow depth of field, but you can't control the lighting and everything is overexposed, you will need an ND or neutral density filter to help darken your image. ND filters come in different strengths that can be stacked on your lens, or you can buy a variable ND filter, which can be rotated to adjust the strength of the darkening. These are very commonly used in Hollywood productions, and I personally use mine all the time. On the other hand, if you don't necessarily care to keep the visual appearance of a shallow depth of field, you can just close down your lens by changing the aperture to a higher f-stop value until you achieve an optimal exposure. On the other side of things, let's talk about what to do if you're using a higher f-stop like f11 and your image is too dark. If you want to keep that type of look where everything is in focus and has no blurry or soft background, you'll need to increase the light somehow. If once again, you're in a situation where you can't really control the light in your scene by increasing the brightness of a light you are using, or by adding additional lights to your scene, you can increase the light by adjusting your ISO. ISO is something that is carried over from the film days and is the film's speed or its sensitivity to light. With film, a faster ISO film would have more grain in it to compensate for the darkness. With digital cameras, film grain has been replaced with digital noise. This would be those little colored speckles that you would sometimes see in images and videos. So if your image is too dark and you don't want to open up your lens to let in more light, and you can't add additional lights to your scene, you can just increase the ISO until you get a proper exposure. Now, just be careful here, because the higher you increase the ISO to, the more digital noise you'll see in your image. Now, most modern digital cameras like DSLRs and mirrorless cameras are pretty good with higher ISOs, but you still don't really want to push it too far, because if you go really far with it, it's going to be really distracting when all you see is these little colored moving speckles all over your image. Okay, well, if you stuck around this long, wow, good for you, congratulations. I know that was a lot of information, but I do have one final tip for you. Now, this is something that a lot of people neglect, but it is still very important. White balance. Setting a proper white balance is super important, so do not forget to do that. Tons of people forget to do this, and I'm guilty of doing this as well from time to time, but it is still one of the first things I do normally check when I'm on set is choosing the appropriate white balance. White balance will ultimately affect the coloration of your footage on a spectrum of warm to cool. The key with white balance is to make your image look as natural or neutral as possible. So if you're shooting out in the sun on a sunny day, you want to use the sun setting on your camera's white balance settings. If you're shooting inside with traditional warm light bulbs, you'll want to set your white balance to tungsten. If the presets on your camera aren't looking good, you can manually adjust the white balance yourself. White balance is usually measured in Kelvin, so all you have to keep in mind is the higher the number, the cooler or more blue the light is, and the lower the number, the warmer or more orange the light is. Natural daylight is typically on the cooler side, with highly overcast being the coolest and bright sunny being slightly warmer, but still on the cool to neutral white side. Sunrise and sunset, traditional light bulbs, and fire or flames range from warm to the warmest. So basically, if your light is on the cooler side, set your white balance color temperature to a higher Kelvin value until everything looks more neutral. What's important here is to just actually set a white balance. Don't use the auto white balance setting on your camera. The reason is, I know normally once you first choose auto, it might give you the best looking image right off the bat. And if you try to cycle through the different white balance options, it still might look better on auto than it does in the other options. But if anything changes in your scene, so if your lighting changes a bit, if you're moving around, the camera might pick things up differently and adjust your white balance while you're recording. So you're gonna see this like weird color shift happening in your video. So this is one of the, I'd say, most distracting things ever, and that could really stop your videos from looking professional and a lot more cinematic. All right, guys, well, there you have it. I know that was a ton of information to take in, so thank you for sticking around and watching it. Like I said earlier, getting that cinematic look isn't just a matter of listening to somebody talking on the internet, telling you what setting to dial in on your camera and just setting it to that and just shooting like that all the time. I really wanted to help you understand a little bit more about the whole thing so that you can properly set your settings accordingly depending on the situation or scenarios you find yourself in. So hopefully you learned a lot and you can take what you learned to make some awesome cinematic looking videos. If you liked what you saw today, or if you found it at all useful, please hit that like button and drop me a comment down below letting me know what part of the video you found most useful. Did you know any of this information that I taught you today? Is there something I was able to clarify for you that you've always been kind of wondering about? Just let me know in the comments down below. Also, it would be a huge help in supporting my channel if you hit that subscribe button. Also, if you ring that little bell notification icon, you'll get notified every single time I drop new videos like this one. There's lots more good stuff coming your way, so make sure you stay tuned. You can also follow me on Instagram at AlexSPerry if you want to stay up to date with what I'm up to and what I'm doing, or if you just want to start a conversation on absolutely anything. My name is Alex Perry, and I will catch you in the next one. Now, let's go make some films.